She stood there in her worn dress while elite guests whispered mockingly until her heavenly voice filled the garden and brought the arrogant CEO to tears of regret. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. Chicago shivered under a February snowstorm, white flakes hammering against the windows of the Trump Tower apartment. Sarah Walker paced across the polished hardwood floors, one hand nervously caressing the small swell beneath her cashmere sweater. At 22, she never imagined she'd be living in a penthouse 60 floors above Michigan Avenue, married to one of Chicago's most eligible bachelors. Now, she had even more unbelievable news to share. She glanced at the dining table she'd meticulously prepared. Richard's favorite steaks from Gibson's, candles waiting to be lit, a bottle of non-alcoholic champagne chilling in ice. For her husband, she'd pour the real thing from the crystal decanter he prized. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times. Richard had promised to be home by 6:30. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. "In final meeting, ETA 45 minutes. Don't wait up for dinner." She sighed, running her fingers through her dark hair. The doctor had confirmed it yesterday, 12 weeks pregnant. She'd suspected for weeks but had been too nervous to check, too afraid of Richard's reaction. They'd never discussed children. Their whirlwind romance had swept her from singing in a small Knoxville restaurant to a Chicago wedding in just 3 months. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, rehearsing the words one more time. "Richard, I have wonderful news. We're going to have a baby." The clock struck 8 when the electronic lock finally beeped. Richard Thompson strode in, still talking into his Bluetooth earpiece, his tall frame impeccably dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit. At 30, he carried himself with the practiced confidence of a man born into wealth and groomed to expand it. "Tell them we're not budging on the Dubai property," he said to whoever was on the call. "The Thompson name means luxury, not compromise." He noticed Sarah and held up one finger, signaling for her to wait. "Get it done, Marcus. I don't care if they threaten to walk. They won't." Sarah stood awkwardly by the dining table, watching as Richard removed his coat, handed it carelessly over a chair, and poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey without acknowledging the dinner she'd prepared. "Sorry about that," he finally said, removing his earpiece. "The Arab investors are being difficult about the design specifications. Don't they realize we've built hotels in 7 countries already?" He took a long sip of his drink, his eyes finally focusing on her. "You look tense. Is something wrong?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. I made dinner. Your favorite steaks." Richard glanced at the table as if just noticing it. "That's nice, but I ate with the investors. You should have texted. I wanted tonight to be special." She moved closer to him, trying to find the warmth that had drawn her to him in Tennessee, when he'd visited the restaurant where she sang and waited tables. "I have news, Richard." Something in her tone made him pause. He set down his glass and studied her face. "What kind of news?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into infinity. Richard's expression didn't change at first. It simply froze, as if his brain needed extra time to process her words. "Pregnant?" he finally said, the word falling from his lips like something distasteful. "How far along?" 12 weeks. I saw the doctor yesterday. Everything looks healthy and... A child? Now?" Richard's voice cut through her excitement like a steel blade. He moved to the bar, turning his back to her as he refilled his glass. "This wasn't in the plans, Sarah. It simply doesn't fit into my life right now." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Sarah wrapped her arms protectively around her midsection. "I know we didn't plan it, but plans change. We can make this work." Richard turned, leaning against the bar, studying her as if she were a business proposal he was about to reject. "You never understood your place, did you?" His tone was eerily conversational, as if discussing the weather. I brought you into this world thinking I could mold you, but you'll always be that waitress singer from Tennessee, a small-town girl trying to pretend she belongs on Michigan Avenue. Each word landed like a physical blow. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. "Richard, this is our child," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "We can make this work. I can postpone any plans, stay home, be the wife you need." His laugh was the cruelest sound Sarah had ever heard, sharp, brittle, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Wife that I need?" Richard swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Sarah, you were an interesting experiment, a temporary trophy, but a Thompson heir needs an appropriate mother, of suitable lineage, not a mediocre bar singer whose family doesn't even have a recognizable surname in Chicago." Sarah felt as if the floor were tilting beneath her feet. "You can't mean that. After everything, I left my family, my career. I gave up everything for you. And that was your mistake, not mine." Richard set his glass down and walked to his desk, opening a drawer to retrieve a checkbook. "I'll be generous. $100,000 for you to disappear. Get an abortion. Don't get an abortion. I don't particularly care. But this marriage ends today." "You can't be serious," Sarah whispered, stunned. "We're married. This is your child." Richard's face hardened. "My lawyers will contact you tomorrow with papers. Sign them, take the money, and go quietly." He picked up the phone on his desk, pressing the intercom button. "Security? Please come to the penthouse, my wife will be leaving." "Security?" Sarah's voice rose in disbelief. "You're calling security on me? I'm your wife." "For approximately 12 more hours," Richard replied coldly. "Pack whatever you brought with you when we married. Leave anything purchased since then." Sarah stood frozen, unable to process the rapid disintegration of her life. "Why are you doing this? What did I do wrong?" Richard sighed, impatience crossing his features. "You didn't do anything wrong per se. You simply never had what it takes for this world. Your talent is common, your education is insufficient, and this baby is a mistake I cannot allow to compromise my future. The Thompsons don't mix with, well, people like you." The elevator dinged, and 2 security guards in black suits stepped into the apartment. Sarah recognized them, the same men who had once smiled at her, called her Mrs. Thompson, held doors open for her. Now they stood awkwardly, avoiding her gaze. "Mrs. Thompson will be leaving," Richard informed them. "Please ensure she takes only her personal possessions." "Richard, please," Sarah begged, tears streaming freely now. "We can talk about this. You can't just throw me out." But Richard had already turned away, returning to his whiskey. "Goodbye, Sarah. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." The next 30 minutes passed in a nightmarish blur. Sarah, sobbing uncontrollably, threw clothes into a suitcase, the same one she'd brought from Knoxville 18 months earlier. The guards stood silently by the door, their presence a constant reminder of how quickly she'd gone from wife to intruder. In the bathroom, she grabbed her few toiletries, catching a glimpse of her tear-stained face in the mirror. She hardly recognized herself, this pale, trembling woman with puffy eyes and smudged makeup. Where was the confident singer Richard had pursued so relentlessly in Tennessee? As she prepared to leave, Sarah grabbed 2 final items. Her composition notebook, filled with songs she'd written but rarely shown Richard, and the sonogram picture from yesterday's appointment. The grainy black and white image showed little more than a bean-shaped blob, but to Sarah, it represented the future Richard was rejecting. The security guards escorted her to the service elevator, not even allowing her the dignity of the main lobby. One of them, the younger one named Miguel, whispered, "I'm sorry, ma'am," as the doors closed. The service entrance opened to an alley behind the building. Snow fell in thick flakes, instantly clinging to Sarah's hair and eyelashes. She hadn't even had time to grab her winter coat. It had been a gift from Richard, so she'd left it behind. Standing on the icy sidewalk in only a light sweater, clutching her suitcase with one hand and instinctively protecting her stomach with the other, Sarah Walker felt the full weight of her situation crash down upon her. In less than an hour, she had gone from pregnant wife to homeless, pregnant ex-wife. She fumbled for her phone with trembling fingers, scrolling through contacts. Her family in Knoxville had warned her about marrying Richard so quickly. They wouldn't welcome this news with anything but, "I told you so." She finally stopped at Ruby's name, a former waitress colleague who'd moved to Chicago a year before Sarah. "Ruby, it's Sarah," she said when her friend answered, trying to keep her voice steady. I need a place to stay tonight. Something's happened." 3 miles away in a cramped apartment in Pilsen, Ruby cleared textbooks from her sofa. "Stay as long as you need," she told Sarah, though the worried look in her eyes suggested she knew this wouldn't be a short-term arrangement. That night, curled on Ruby's lumpy sofa under a thin blanket, Sarah placed one hand on her stomach and whispered to the life growing inside her, "We'll be okay. Somehow, we'll be okay." But as she stared at the water stain on the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar noises of the building, she wondered how she'd gone from singing in a Tennessee restaurant to a luxury penthouse to homelessness in less than 2 years. That freezing February night, as she trembled on a borrowed sofa, her hand protectively cradling her 12-week pregnancy, Sarah Walker couldn't possibly imagine that in 15 years she would be accepting Businesswoman of the Year, commanding a billion-dollar empire, while Richard Thompson faced the bankruptcy of his family legacy. The harsh morning light filtering through Ruby's thin curtains woke Sarah before the alarm. For a disorienting moment, she expected to feel Egyptian cotton sheets and smell freshly brewed coffee prepared by the Trump Tower's staff. Instead, she felt the scratchy fabric of Ruby's second-hand couch and smelled microwaved ramen from the night before. 6 days had passed since Richard had thrown her out. 6 days of crying, barely eating, and wondering how her life had imploded so completely. "You're up early," Ruby said, padding into the living room in worn slippers. Her small studio apartment barely accommodated one person, let alone 2. "Morning sickness?" Sarah nodded, pulling herself to a sitting position. "It's more like all-day sickness. The doctor said it might ease up after the first trimester." Ruby's lips pressed into a sympathetic line. "Any word from the bastard?" "Nothing." Sarah checked her phone. No missed calls, no texts, not even an email from Richard. She'd called him 23 times in the past 6 days. Each call went straight to voicemail. "It's like I suddenly stopped existing. You need to eat something. For the baby." Ruby placed a bowl of cereal on the coffee table. "And you need to figure out what's next. You can crash here for a while, but my landlord will notice eventually." Sarah picked at the cereal, forcing herself to take small bites. "I have an interview at a music store this afternoon. Just part-time, but it's something." Ruby nodded encouragingly. "Good. What about calling your parents? I know things are strained, but—" "They warned me not to marry him," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "Dad said, 'Men like that don't marry girls like us unless there's something wrong.' I can't call now and prove him right." Later that morning, Sarah stood before the bathroom mirror, trying to look presentable for her interview. The woman staring back looked nothing like the polished wife of Richard Thompson. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her clothes, the few she'd managed to grab before being escorted out, looked rumpled and out of place without the context of her former life. She placed a hand on her stomach, still mostly flat except for the small curve that only she could detect. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, words that had become her daily mantra. The interview at Harmony Music Store lasted exactly 12 minutes. The manager, a bearded man in his 50s, glanced repeatedly at her application. "You've got no retail experience," he noted, frowning. "I'm a quick learner," Sarah offered. "And I know music. I was a professional singer before." "And this gap here?" He pointed to her employment history. "No work for 18 months?" Sarah swallowed hard. "I was married. My husband preferred that I didn't work." The manager's eyes flickered to her left hand, where the tan line of her recently removed wedding ring was still visible. His gaze then moved almost imperceptibly to her midsection. "We're looking for long-term commitment," he said, his tone softening with what Sarah recognized as pity. "Someone who can grow with the store." "I am committed," Sarah insisted, leaning forward. "I need this job. I'll work any hours, learn whatever you need me to. I'm sorry, Mrs. He glanced at the application again. "Walker, we'll keep your application on file." Sarah knew what that meant. She'd said the same thing to countless hopeful applicants at the restaurant in Knoxville. That night, she performed at the Rusty Nail, a dive bar in Wicker Park that hosted open mic nights on Tuesdays. The manager had agreed to let her sing 3 songs, with the possibility of a regular weekend spot if the crowd liked her. The stage, if it could be called that, was merely a corner cleared of tables. The sound system crackled with feedback as Sarah adjusted the microphone. "Hi, I'm Sarah," she said to the scattered audience, most of whom continued their conversations without looking up. "This first song is called Breathe Again." As she sang, Sarah poured everything into her performance, her heartbreak, her fear, her determination. By the second verse, a few patrons had turned to listen. By the chorus, the conversations had dimmed. When she finished, the applause was genuine, if sparse. The manager approached as she stepped off stage. "Not bad. Thursday and Friday nights, 9 to 11, $50 per night plus whatever's in the tip jar." It wasn't much, but it was something. A starting point. 2 weeks later, Sarah sat in the sterile waiting room of Klein, Hoffman & Associates, the law firm representing Richard. She'd received a formal letter requesting her presence to discuss the dissolution of marriage. Her hands trembled as she clutched her purse. Inside was a letter from her doctor confirming her pregnancy and a hastily written list of demands: reasonable child support, medical coverage for the baby, a modest alimony to help her get back on her feet. "Mrs. Thompson?" a sleek receptionist called. "They'll see you now." The conference room intimidated with its mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. 3 attorneys in expensive suits waited, but no Richard. "He's not coming?" Sarah asked, unable to mask her disappointment. Mr. Thompson felt his presence would be counterproductive, the oldest attorney replied smoothly. "I'm Charles Klein. We've prepared a very generous offer." He slid a document across the table. Sarah scanned the first page, her heart sinking. $200,000, she read aloud, "in exchange for a confidential divorce and," her voice caught, "complete termination of parental rights?" "Mr. Thompson offers this sum with no admission of fault," Klein continued. "The alternative would be contesting the marriage on grounds of fraud and potential legal action for extortion." "Extortion?" Sarah's voice rose. "I'm carrying his child." "A pregnancy you allegedly concealed until after marriage," another attorney interjected. "Mr. Thompson recalls specific conversations where you agreed children weren't in your immediate plans." "That was before I knew I was pregnant." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "And what about child support? This baby is half his responsibility." Klein's smile never reached his eyes. "The sum offered exceeds any mandatory child support for at least 5 years. Additionally, should you pursue a contested divorce, Mr. Thompson is prepared to request genetic testing and full custody should the child prove to be his." "Full custody?" Sarah whispered, her hand instinctively covering her stomach. "He told me he didn't want this baby." "Mr. Thompson believes a child of his should be raised with certain advantages," Klein replied. "Advantages he's uniquely positioned to provide." The threat was clear. Take the money and disappear, or risk losing her child to Richard's wealth and influence. With trembling hands, Sarah signed the papers in March, each signature feeling like a betrayal to the life growing inside her. She told herself she had no choice. Fighting Richard would drain the settlement money she desperately needed. April brought complications. Spotting led to a terrifying trip to the emergency room where Sarah waited hours before being seen. Threatened miscarriage, the doctor explained, examining the ultrasound. "The good news is the baby's heartbeat is strong. The bad news is you need bed rest for at least 2 weeks." "I can't," Sarah protested. "I have to work. I sing at night and I just got a day job at a coffee shop." The doctor's expression was sympathetic but firm. "If you want to keep this pregnancy, you need to rest. Stress and physical exertion are your enemies right now." 2 weeks of bed rest depleted Sarah's meager savings. The coffee shop couldn't hold her position. The bar replaced her with another singer. May arrived with an eviction notice on the door of the small room she'd rented after leaving Ruby's apartment. "I'm sorry," her landlady said, genuine regret in her voice. "I've got my own bills to pay and you're 2 months behind." June found Sarah alternating between a women's shelter and sleeping in her car, a 10-year-old Honda she'd purchased with part of the settlement. The car's back seat was piled with her possessions: clothes, the few personal items she'd saved, and her growing collection of pregnancy books and baby items found at thrift stores. She continued to sing wherever she could: coffee shops during open mic afternoons, small bars that paid in cash, even street performances when the weather was good. Her expanding belly limited what she could wear, but she'd found a thrift store maternity dress that looked presentable enough for performances. It was during one such performance at a karaoke bar in Wicker Park that Sarah's voice caught the attention of an older woman sitting alone near the back. Sarah was singing, "I Will Survive," her voice strong despite her circumstances, one hand resting on her 7-month belly. After the performance, as Sarah collected the meager tips from the jar, the woman approached. "You have something special," she said, her voice carrying the slight rasp of a longtime smoker, "a authenticity that's hard to find." "Thank you," Sarah replied, too exhausted to engage in conversation. "My name is Eleanor Matthews," the woman continued, offering a business card. "I used to produce for Atlantic Records back when producers actually cared about talent." Sarah glanced at the card. "Eleanor Matthews, music industry consultant." "And it seems like you need help," Eleanor added, her shrewd eyes taking in Sarah's worn appearance and advanced pregnancy. "I'm fine," Sarah responded automatically, pride flaring despite her circumstances. Eleanor laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "Honey, I've been in this business 40 years. I know fine when I see it, and you're not it." She gestured to the exit. "Let me buy you a late dinner, and we can talk. No strings." Something about Eleanor's direct manner broke through Sarah's carefully constructed walls. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or the genuine concern in the older woman's eyes, but Sarah found herself nodding. Over plates of eggs and toast at an all-night diner, Eleanor listened as Sarah shared a sanitized version of her story. Young singer marries wealthy businessman. Marriage falls apart. Pregnant and starting over. "The music industry is changing," Eleanor said when Sarah finished. "The traditional labels are dying because they don't understand the digital revolution. There's opportunity there for those with courage." "I just need to survive until the baby comes," Sarah admitted. "Then I can think about music again." Eleanor studied her thoughtfully. "I have a spare room in my house. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and quiet. You could stay there until you get on your feet." Sarah's instinct was to refuse. She'd learned the hard way that offers often came with hidden costs. But the thought of another night in her car, growing more uncomfortable with each passing day of pregnancy, weakened her resolve. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "I know talent when I hear it," Eleanor replied simply. "And I know what it's like to be a woman alone in this industry." She pushed her plate aside. "Besides, I could use some help with my consulting business. Administrative work, organizing contracts, tracking royalty payments. Nothing glamorous, but it's steady." 2 weeks later, Sarah moved into Eleanor's modest house in Rogers Park. Her room was small but comfortable, with a real bed and a window overlooking a tiny garden. For the first time in months, she slept through the night without fear. During the day, she worked as Eleanor's assistant, learning the intricate details of music contracts and royalty structures. The work fascinated her, the complexity of how artists were paid, the various revenue streams, the emerging digital platforms changing how music reached listeners. Most artists have no idea how they're being exploited, Eleanor explained one afternoon, showing Sarah a typical record contract. Look at this clause. The label recoups all expenses before the artist sees a penny, including ridiculous charges for promotion and distribution. Sarah absorbed everything, taking notes obsessively, asking questions that impressed Eleanor with their insight. At night, she studied digital distribution and emerging platforms like iTunes and the newly launched Spotify. In August, her belly now prominently displayed, Sarah began accompanying Eleanor to meetings with independent artists, taking notes and occasionally offering observations that earned approving nods from her mentor. When September arrived, so did the contractions. Eleanor drove Sarah to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, staying through the grueling 18-hour labor. "You're almost there," the doctor encouraged as Sarah pushed. "One more big one." With a final, exhausting effort, Sarah delivered her son. The nurse placed the squirming, red-faced infant on her chest. "He's perfect," Eleanor whispered from beside the bed. Sarah gazed down at her son, taking in his shock of dark hair, and, when he briefly opened them, eyes of intense blue, Thompson blue. In that moment, all the hardship of the past months crystallized into fierce, protective love. Later, when Eleanor had gone home and the hospital had quieted for the night, Sarah held her sleeping son close. "He said I wasn't enough," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "That my talent was mediocre, that my future was insignificant. I'm going to prove that every word was a lie, my son, and one day we'll make Richard Thompson swallow every syllable of contempt." While scribbling her primitive concept for what would one day become the revolutionary Nightingale app, Sarah couldn't imagine she was planting the seeds of a company that, in a decade, would be valued in the billions and forever change the relationship between musical artists and their audience. The promise Sarah whispered to her newborn son became her daily mantra. Each morning, as she cradled Ethan while preparing for the day, she would repeat it silently. "We'll prove him wrong." Eleanor's modest house in Rogers Park became a haven of possibilities. The spare room Eleanor had offered was small but painted in warm yellow tones, with a second-hand crib that Eleanor had mysteriously produced 2 days before Sarah gave birth. "It was my grandson's," she had explained, brushing away Sarah's tears of gratitude. "He's in college now. Time flies, dear." A week after bringing Ethan home, Sarah sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, the baby sleeping in a bassinet beside her, as Eleanor laid out her vision over steaming mugs of tea. "The music industry is experiencing its biggest disruption since the invention of recorded sound," Eleanor said, pushing her reading glasses up her nose. "The major labels are terrified of digital distribution, fighting it instead of adapting. But that's where the future is." Sarah nodded, absorbing every word while keeping one hand gently resting on Ethan's bassinet. "I noticed that when I was singing in Knoxville. People would ask if they could download my music, but I had nothing to offer them." "Exactly," Eleanor tapped the table emphatically. "Artists need direct access to their audiences. The traditional gatekeepers, labels, distributors, retailers, they all take their cut, leaving crumbs for the actual creators." Sarah watched as Eleanor pulled out contracts from her consulting business, spreading them across the table. The documents were dense with legal language, but Eleanor patiently explained each section, highlighting the inequities built into the standard agreements. "See this?" Eleanor pointed to a clause buried on page 17 of a recording contract. "The artist is responsible for recouping all production costs before earning a penny in royalties. Meanwhile, the label owns the master recordings in perpetuity." "That seems incredibly one-sided," Sarah said, frowning as she studied the document. "It's highway robbery dressed up in legal jargon," Eleanor replied with a snort. "Been that way for decades. I've watched countless talented musicians work themselves to the bone only to end up broke while executives buy second homes in the Hamptons." When Ethan began to fuss, Sarah lifted him to her shoulder, patting his back gently while continuing to examine the contracts. She found herself strangely fascinated by the business mechanics behind the music she'd always loved. The next morning, Eleanor showed Sarah to a small home office with Nightingale Music Consulting on the door. "This is where I work," Eleanor explained, gesturing to the modest setup. A desk with a computer, filing cabinets, and walls lined with gold and platinum records from her producing days. "You'll help me organize contracts, track royalty payments, and manage correspondence with clients. It's not glamorous, but it pays, and you'll learn the business from the inside." "I don't know what to say," Sarah replied, bouncing Ethan gently as he began to fuss. "This is more than I deserve." Eleanor fixed her with a stern look. "Stop that right now. You deserve a hell of a lot more than you've gotten, young lady. Talent and determination should be rewarded, not punished." She softened her expression. "Besides, I'm not running a charity. You'll earn your keep." And earn it she did. Sarah proved to be a quick study, organizing Eleanor's chaotic filing system and bringing digital efficiency to the small consulting business. During Ethan's naps, she immersed herself in the intricacies of music licensing, digital rights, and emerging distribution platforms. In the evenings, after putting Ethan to bed, Sarah would often find Eleanor in the living room, watching industry news with a critical eye. "Look at this nonsense," Eleanor would say, gesturing to the television where music executives declared that digital piracy would destroy the industry. "They're fighting the future instead of figuring out how to make it work for artists." 2 months after moving in, Sarah was inputting royalty data when she noticed a startling pattern. "Eleanor, these streaming numbers don't make sense. The artist had over 1 million streams but only received a check for $87? Eleanor peered over her shoulder. "Welcome to the streaming economy, dear. The major platforms pay fractions of pennies per stream, and then the labels take their cut." "But that's—" Sarah struggled to find the right word. "Theft?" Eleanor supplied. "Yes, but legal theft, backed by contracts these artists signed without understanding the implications." That night, as Sarah fed Ethan his late bottle, she couldn't stop thinking about the inequities she was discovering. She whispered to her drowsy son, "There has to be a better way, a fairer system." On a rainy Saturday in November, Eleanor surprised Sarah with a worn laptop. "It's refurbished," Eleanor explained, setting it up on Sarah's small desk. "Nothing fancy, but it works. If you're going to understand today's music business, you need to understand technology." Sarah stared at the gift, overwhelmed. "I don't know the first thing about computers beyond basic email and word processing." "Then learn," Eleanor said simply. "There are free coding courses online. Start with the basics, HTML, CSS, then move to something more substantial like JavaScript or Python." Sarah laughed in disbelief. "You expect me to learn programming? With a 2-month-old baby?" Eleanor's expression remained serious. "I expect you to invest in your future, 1 hour a night after Ethan's asleep. The music industry's future belongs to those who understand both music and technology." That night, after settling Ethan, Sarah opened the laptop and navigated to a free coding tutorial. The strange syntax looked like an alien language, but she was determined to understand. An hour turned into 2 as she absorbed the basics of HTML. The pattern became her new normal, caring for Ethan, working for Eleanor during the day, and teaching herself coding at night. Often, Eleanor would find her asleep at the small desk, head resting on coding tutorials, and gently drape a blanket over her shoulders. As months passed, Sarah's understanding of both the music business and basic programming grew in tandem. She created simple websites for Eleanor's clients and developed a basic database to track royalty payments more efficiently. Spring arrived, and with it, Ethan's increasing mobility. Now crawling and pulling himself up on furniture, he required constant vigilance. Sarah adapted, working with him in a playpen beside her desk, taking calls while bouncing him on her hip, programming with one hand while feeding him with the other. "I've never seen anyone with your determination," Eleanor remarked one evening, watching as Sarah simultaneously coded a simple web page while singing softly to soothe a teething Ethan. Most people would have collapsed under half the pressure you've faced. Sarah looked up, dark circles under her eyes but determination in her gaze. I don't have the luxury of collapse. Every day, every skill I learn brings me one step closer to providing Ethan the life he deserves. By summer, Ethan was 9 months old and beginning to babble his first proto-words. Sarah had progressed to more complex programming concepts and had developed a deeper understanding of digital distribution models. One evening, as Eleanor and Sarah sat on the porch watching Ethan play on a blanket in the small garden, Eleanor broached a subject they'd been circling for months. "The industry needs disruption," she said, sipping iced tea. "A platform that puts artists first, that gives them direct access to their fans without a dozen middlemen taking cuts." Sarah nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. Something transparent, where artists can see exactly who's listening, where, and how much they're earning in real time. "The technology exists," Eleanor continued. "What's missing is the will to challenge the status quo." That night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, Sarah sketched a rough concept in her notebook. A platform where artists could upload music directly, set their own prices, and receive the vast majority of revenue. At the top of the page, she drew a small bird, a nightingale, in mid-song. The year passed in a blur of growth, Ethan taking his first steps, saying his first words, developing a personality that delighted both Sarah and Eleanor. By his first birthday, celebrated with a small cake in Eleanor's garden, he was a curious, energetic toddler with Richard's striking blue eyes but Sarah's gentle temperament. As Ethan grew, so did Sarah's vision for what would eventually become the Nightingale platform. Her crude sketches evolved into detailed flowcharts and wireframes. She spent hours researching existing music distribution platforms, identifying their weaknesses and imagining alternatives. The day Ethan turned 15 months old, Sarah experienced a moment that crystallized her determination. Standing in line at the grocery store, exhausted after a day of work and childcare, she spotted a familiar face on the cover of a business magazine. Richard Thompson, smiling confidently beneath the headline, "Thompson Hotels Expands Global Footprint." Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the magazine. The article praised Richard's bold vision and impeccable judgment. A photo spread showed him hosting a charity gala, a willowy blonde on his arm, both dripping in obvious wealth. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, Sarah sat at her desk and stared at her nightingale drawing. With newfound resolve, she began detailing her concept more concretely, outlining a business model that would challenge the very industry that had exploited her and countless other artists. When Ethan was 18 months old, tragedy struck. Eleanor, who had become family to both Sarah and Ethan, suffered a massive heart attack while working in her garden. Despite emergency services' quick response, she passed away that evening at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, with Sarah holding her hand. The funeral was modest but well attended by musicians and industry professionals who had benefited from Eleanor's guidance over the decades. Sarah stood numbly at the graveside, holding Ethan's hand, the toddler too young to understand the permanence of what had happened. A week later, Sarah met with Eleanor's lawyer, a kind-faced woman named Margaret who had been Eleanor's friend for 40 years. Eleanor updated her will 6 months ago, Margaret explained gently. She was very specific about her wishes. Sarah nodded, expecting to hear about arrangements for the house, preparing herself to find a new place to live. "To Sarah Walker, my dear friend who is like a daughter," Margaret read from the document, "I leave my music catalog and the sum of $10,000. Use it wisely, change the industry like we talked about, and remember that the bird sings sweetest when it sings freely." Sarah broke down, overwhelmed by Eleanor's final act of faith in her. The music catalog, while modest, represented steady income from songs Eleanor had produced in the 70s and 80s. The $10,000 was more money than Sarah had seen since the divorce settlement, most of which had been depleted by medical bills and survival. That evening, after Ethan was asleep, Sarah sat in Eleanor's, now her, living room and made a decision. Chicago held too many painful memories, from Richard's rejection to Eleanor's death. New York, with its vibrant music scene and tech startup culture, offered the fresh start they needed. 2 weeks later, Sarah and Ethan arrived in Queens, New York. The basement apartment she had rented sight unseen was far from ideal, damp with water stains on the ceiling and the persistent smell of the Chinese restaurant above, but it was what she could afford while preserving Eleanor's money for her true purpose. As she set up Ethan's portable crib in the corner of what would serve as both their bedroom and her workspace, Sarah felt a strange mix of grief and hope. She arranged her desk, a fold-out table purchased at a thrift store, facing the room's single window, which offered a view of feet passing by on the sidewalk above. That night, with Ethan finally asleep on his mattress beside her folding sofa bed, Sarah opened her laptop and began researching what it would take to build a digital music distribution platform from scratch. While rapidly scribbling her primitive concept for what would one day become the revolutionary Nightingale app, Sarah couldn't imagine she was planting the seeds of a company that, in a decade, would be valued in the billions and forever change the relationship between musical artists and their audience. The laptop screen cast a blue glow across Sarah's face as she stared at the email. Eleanor's lawyer had sent the final details of the modest inheritance, the music catalog rights and a bank transfer for $10,000. In the dim light of the Queen's basement, the sum seemed simultaneously enormous and impossibly small for what she needed to accomplish. "This is it, Ethan," she whispered to her sleeping son, his tiny chest rising and falling on the makeshift bed. "Everything changes now." 3 months had passed since Eleanor's death. The grief still appeared in unexpected moments, when Sarah heard a jazz standard Eleanor had loved, or when she encountered a business problem and instinctively reached for the phone to call her mentor. But with grief came resolve. Eleanor had believed in her vision for a fairer music industry. Sarah would not let that faith be misplaced. The basement apartment in Queens was a far cry from the Trump Tower penthouse where she had once lived. Water stains marked the ceiling in concentric circles, expanding whenever it rained heavily. The landlord, Mr. Patel, had assured her the roof would be fixed very soon, the same promise he'd made when she signed the lease. Sarah had converted the single room into a multi-purpose space. One corner held Ethan's small bed, another her sofa that converted to her sleeping space, and the third corner housed her workstation, a rickety desk supporting her laptop and growing stacks of notes on music distribution platforms. Her days had fallen into a relentless rhythm. Mornings were devoted to Ethan, now an energetic 3-year-old with boundless curiosity. By 9, she would drop him at an affordable daycare 3 blocks away, then hurry to the local coffee shop where she wrote web content for various clients, mostly small businesses needing product descriptions or blog posts. The freelance work paid just enough to cover rent and basic necessities. Evenings belonged to her dream. After putting Ethan to bed at 8, Sarah would open her laptop and work on the Nightingale prototype until her eyes burned with exhaustion. "Just a few more tweaks," she muttered, adjusting code for the artist upload interface she'd been designing. The prototype was primitive, but its concept was revolutionary. Direct distribution from artists to listeners, with transparent accounting and the vast majority of revenue returning to creators. A steady drip from the ceiling interrupted her concentration. Sarah sighed, placing a pot under the leak and returning to her work. 10 minutes later, another drip started in a different location. By midnight, during a sudden downpour, 5 containers collected water across the small room. "Perfect!" she groaned, moving Ethan's bed away from a new leak that threatened to soak his blankets. The boy stirred but didn't wake, accustomed to middle-of-night disruptions. Sleep came in fitful bursts that night, her dreams filled with lines of code and worry about the roof potentially collapsing. When morning arrived, Sarah's alarm jolted her from a brief, deep sleep that had come just an hour before. "Rise and shine, little man," she called, summoning energy she didn't feel as she gently woke Ethan. "Hungry, Mama," he replied, rubbing his eyes with small fists. Sarah opened the cabinet above their miniature refrigerator. "We have—" She paused, staring at the nearly empty shelf. "We have the last of the Cheerios. We'll get more groceries today." She made a mental calculation. The freelance payment for her latest project wouldn't clear until Friday, 3 days away. The emergency $20 bill in her wallet would have to stretch. After dropping Ethan at daycare with a kiss and promise of a special dinner, she didn't specify what made it special. Creativity would be required given their resources. Sarah headed to her usual table at the back of Grounded Coffee. The owner, Lily, a tattooed woman in her 40s, gave her a sympathetic nod. "Rough night? You look like you could use an extra shot," Lily said, sliding Sarah's usual black coffee across the counter. "The roof situation's getting worse," Sarah replied, pulling out her laptop. "I'm one good rainstorm away from needing an arc." Lily frowned. "Patel's a slumlord. You should report him. And risk losing the cheapest rent in Queens? I'll manage." Sarah logged into her freelance account, relieved to see a new project offer. Product descriptions for a kitchenware company. Low-paying but straightforward work. For 6 hours, Sarah wrote enthusiastic paragraphs about spatulas and mixing bowls, submitting the final batch just in time to pick up Ethan. That evening, she created special dinner by cutting the last hot dog into octopus shapes that made Ethan giggle with delight. After tucking him in, she returned to the Nightingale prototype. Tonight's goal was finishing the payment distribution algorithm, ensuring artists could see exactly where their money came from and when it would hit their accounts. As she worked, her phone buzzed with a news alert from the business application she'd configured to track Richard's activities. The headline made her pause. "Thompson Hotels announces $200 million wedding venue in Chicago." Against her better judgment, Sarah clicked the link. There he was, Richard Thompson, standing beside a slender blonde woman identified as socialite Catherine Carlton, daughter of banking executive William Carlton. They posed before architectural renderings of an extravagant wedding venue, Richard's arm possessively around Catherine's waist. The Carlton-Thompson wedding, scheduled for June, will be the venue's inaugural event, the article explained. Sources estimate the wedding budget exceeds $1 million. Sarah stared at Richard's face, confident, successful, apparently moving on to the perfect society marriage. Meanwhile, she was collecting rainwater in cooking pots and stretching hot dogs to make her child smile. "No," she whispered, closing the browser tab forcefully. "This doesn't define us." She worked with renewed intensity that night, channeling her anger into productivity. By 3 a.m, she had completed the payment algorithm and sketched designs for the user experience flow. The next week brought disaster. Heavy storms flooded the basement apartment, damaging Sarah's sofa bed and soaking boxes of Ethan's clothes. Mr. Patel offered no assistance beyond a shrug and vague promises to look into it when the weather clears. That night, Sarah and Ethan slept in her car, parked behind the coffee shop with Lily's permission. Ethan, thinking it an adventure, fell asleep quickly in the reclined passenger seat. Sarah remained awake, staring through the windshield at the rain, wondering how she'd fallen so far. Morning brought clarity and determination. She couldn't continue like this. The basement apartment was uninhabitable, and Ethan deserved better. With steely resolve, Sarah withdrew $3,000 from Eleanor's inheritance, money she'd intended for Nightingale development, and secured a small but dry one-bedroom apartment in a less convenient but safer building. "This is temporary," she promised herself as she signed the lease, a necessary step backward before leaping forward. The new apartment, while basic, became their sanctuary. Sarah converted the bedroom for Ethan and made the living room her combination workspace and sleeping area. With decent Wi-Fi and a stable roof, she could work more efficiently on both freelance projects and the Nightingale prototype. By the winter of 2012, Sarah had developed a functioning demo that allowed artists to upload music and receive payments directly from listeners. The interface was rudimentary, the features limited, but the core concept worked. She began approaching independent musicians at small venues throughout Queens and Brooklyn, showing them her prototype on her laptop. Most dismissed her politely. Some laughed outright at the idea that a single mother working from a converted living room could challenge the entire music distribution industry. But a few, particularly those burned by traditional label contracts, showed interest. "So I'd get 90% of what people pay?" asked Marcus, a jazz saxophonist who performed at a small club in Williamsburg, "and I can see exactly who's listening and where they're located?" "That's right," Sarah confirmed, showing him the analytics dashboard she'd built. "Complete transparency, direct payment, and you maintain ownership of your master recordings." Marcus became the first artist to officially sign with Nightingale, uploading 3 tracks to the Primitive platform. The trickle of other artists that followed was slow but steady, mostly friends of Marcus who'd heard about the favorable terms. Sarah's days grew longer. Freelance work paid the bills while every spare moment went to refining Nightingale and recruiting artists. Ethan, now approaching 4, showed remarkable adaptability and independence for his age, often playing quietly beside her desk with second-hand toys while she coded. One evening, as Sarah hunched over her laptop debugging a payment processing error, Ethan tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, no more cereal." Sarah glanced at the clock, nearly 10 at night, well past when she should have prepared dinner. Lost in work, she'd forgotten to feed her own child. Guilt washed over her as she closed the laptop. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Let's make some—" She opened the cabinet, finding it nearly empty except for a package of ramen noodles. "Let's make some special noodles." As she prepared the instant meal, the 3rd special dinner that week, Sarah questioned whether she was being selfish. Was her obsession with Nightingale taking her away from Ethan? Should she abandon the dream and focus solely on stable income? That question was answered the following day. While checking his development milestone chart from pediatrician visits, Sarah realized Ethan had missed his 3-year checkup entirely. Scheduling an appointment revealed their insurance had lapsed. She'd missed the renewal deadline while working on Nightingale's database structure. The pediatrician, understanding their situation, agreed to a reduced cash payment. As she examined Ethan, she commented casually, "He's quite verbal for his age, very articulate." "He talks all the time," Sarah agreed, watching as Ethan cooperatively followed the doctor's instructions. "And he seems to have excellent recall. Has he shown any particular interests or aptitudes?" Sarah hesitated. "He likes music, hums melodies after hearing them just once." The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "You might want to nurture that. Even simple instruments or music classes could be beneficial for his development." That evening, Sarah made a difficult decision. She would continue pursuing Nightingale, but with stricter boundaries. Ethan's well-being had to come first, which meant structured time for both work and parenting. The first test of her new prototype came in early spring, when a local rapper from Brooklyn agreed to release his new EP exclusively through Nightingale. Sarah worked through the night to ensure the platform could handle the anticipated traffic. When the EP went live, she watched anxiously as the first listeners discovered the music, made purchases, and the payments correctly transferred to the artist's account. By midnight, the rapper had made more from direct sales than his previous release had earned in 6 months on traditional platforms. "This actually works," he called to tell her, excitement evident in his voice. "I can see exactly who's buying, where they're located, everything. This is revolutionary." Sarah allowed herself a moment of pure joy. She'd built something real, something that worked, something that fulfilled Eleanor's vision of a fairer music industry. To celebrate the milestone, she took Ethan for ice cream the next day, a small cupcake with a candle stuck in it, accompanied by juice boxes for an impromptu toast. "What are we celebrating, Mama?" Ethan asked, eyes wide at the unexpected treat. "The future," Sarah replied, clinking her juice box against his. "And promises kept." As they walked home hand in hand, Sarah spotted a magazine in a store window. Richard and his fiancée on the cover of a business publication, headline proclaiming Thompson Carlton, the marriage of business dynasties. She paused only briefly before continuing past, Ethan's small hand warm in hers. Richard's path no longer defined her own. She was building something he could never imagine, a future where talent and determination, not privilege and connections, would determine success. While celebrating with Ethan her first small success in a basement with leaks, Sarah didn't imagine that in 7 years she would be on a stage receiving an award from Billboard as the executive who revolutionized digital music distribution, with Richard Thompson among the audience watching with bitterness. The damp basement with water stains became a distant memory as Sarah stepped through the doors of her first legitimate office space in Brooklyn. The small commercial unit, nestled between a vintage clothing store and a family-owned bakery, represented a monumental step forward. A far cry from luxury, the space offered the bare essentials: 2 desks, functioning electricity, and most importantly, no leaks when it rained. "This is it, Ethan," she said, holding her 5-year-old's hand as they surveyed the empty room. Nightingale's first real home. Ethan looked around with solemn curiosity, his blue eyes, Richard's eyes, taking in every detail. "It's big, Mama." Sarah laughed. At 400 square feet, the office was hardly spacious, but compared to their converted living room workspace, it felt enormous. "It'll be even bigger when we grow." The office marked the culmination of months of careful planning following Mike Chen's investment. She'd met Mike at a tech startup mixer she'd forced herself to attend, despite feeling desperately out of place among the confident young entrepreneurs in their branded hoodies and designer sneakers. In her thrift store blazer and worn flats, she'd stood in a corner, clutching her laptop containing the Nightingale prototype. When her turn came to pitch to the room of potential investors, most had shown polite disinterest at best. 90% revenue to artists? One venture capitalist had scoffed. "That's not a sustainable business model. Where's your profit margin?" "Volume and ancillary services," Sarah had answered confidently, despite her racing heart. "Artists will bring their audiences and will scale through network effects." The room had remained skeptical, except for one man, Mike Chen, a former bassist turned angel investor who approached her afterward. "They don't understand the revolution you're proposing," he'd said, his eyes alight with interest. "The current system is broken. Musicians know it. Fans know it. Only the executives pretend otherwise." 3 meetings later, Mike had written a check for $150,000 in exchange for a small equity stake in Nightingale. The investment wasn't huge by tech startup standards, but to Sarah it represented validation and, more practically, enough runway to hire help and secure legitimate office space. Now, as she arranged her desk in the new office, Sarah could hardly believe how far they'd come since those days in the leaky basement. The Nightingale platform had grown to host nearly 300 independent artists, mostly in the New York area, with a small but devoted user base of music fans who appreciated the direct connection to creators. Her first hire, a talented programmer named Raj who'd recently graduated from NYU, arrived later that morning. "This is real," Sarah whispered to herself as she watched him set up his workstation. No longer was Nightingale just her late-night project. It was becoming a legitimate company with employees and investors. That evening, Sarah and Ethan moved into their new apartment in Brooklyn, a modest 1-bedroom but in a safe building with reliable heat and a rooftop where residents could gather on summer evenings. After years of financial precarity, the stability felt almost unnerving. "Mama, is this our forever home?" Ethan asked as she tucked him into his new bed in his very own bedroom, no longer a corner of a shared space. Sarah kissed his forehead. "For now, little man, but someday we'll have an even better one." Once Ethan was asleep, Sarah unpacked the one luxury she'd allowed herself with Mike's investment, a keyboard for Ethan. Nothing fancy, just a basic electronic model she'd found on sale, but it represented her commitment to nurturing whatever talents her son possessed. The next morning established their new routine. Sarah would prepare breakfast, drop Ethan at a neighborhood daycare with better facilities than his previous one, and walk to the Nightingale office where she and Raj would work on expanding the platform's capabilities. 2 weeks after setting up the office, Sarah noticed something unexpected while picking up Ethan from daycare. Rather than playing with the other children, he sat at the classroom's small, upright piano, picking out a melody with surprising precision for a 5-year-old. Ms. Diaz, Ethan's teacher, approached Sarah with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mrs. Walker, I need to speak with you about Ethan." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, the reflexive worry of a parent hearing those words. "Is everything okay?" "More than okay," Ms. Diaz reassured her. "I've been teaching for 15 years, and I've never seen a child his age with such natural musical intuition. He's been spending all his free time at the piano this week, teaching himself melodies by ear." Sarah watched her son, his small fingers finding notes with uncanny accuracy, repeating a tune he must have heard somewhere. "He's always loved music," she said softly. "This is more than just love," Ms. Diaz insisted. "Your son has a gift, a rare one." That evening, Sarah presented Ethan with the keyboard she'd purchased. His eyes widened with delight as she set it up in his room. "Is it really mine?" he asked, fingers hovering reverently over the keys. "All yours," she confirmed. "Ms. Diaz says you've been playing the piano at school." Without responding, Ethan sat before the keyboard and began playing, a simple but recognizable rendition of a classical piece Sarah vaguely identified as Mozart. She stood transfixed, watching his small hands move with confidence across the keys, his face a study in concentration. "Ethan, how did you learn that?" she asked when he finished. He shrugged, the gesture endearingly casual for what had just transpired. "I heard it on the video Ms. Diaz played during quiet time. I just remembered how it sounded." In the weeks that followed, Ethan's musical ability blossomed with the keyboard at home. He would spend hours after daycare teaching himself songs from memory, occasionally asking Sarah to find videos of piano performances online so he could study them. Meanwhile, Nightingale continued its steady growth. Mike's investment allowed Sarah to focus on building the platform rather than chasing freelance work. She and Raj developed new features, enhanced analytics for artists, improved discovery tools for listeners, and a more robust payment system. The tipping point came when a popular indie band from Brooklyn, frustrated with their label's accounting practices, decided to release their new EP exclusively on Nightingale. Their devoted fan base followed, bringing thousands of new users to the platform overnight. Sarah's phone rang at 3 in the morning with server alerts. Nightingale was buckling under the sudden traffic surge. She spent the next 12 hours with Raj implementing emergency scaling solutions, fueled by coffee and determination. When the crisis passed, Sarah realized they'd reached a critical milestone. Nightingale wasn't just surviving, it was becoming a legitimate contender in the digital music space. During a rare free weekend, Sarah took Ethan to a free community concert in Prospect Park. As the orchestra played, she noticed her son watching the pianist with intense focus, his fingers subtly moving in his lap, mirroring the performer's movements. A silver-haired woman seated next to them noticed too. "Your son seems quite taken with the music," she commented during intermission. "He loves piano," Sarah explained. "He's been teaching himself." "I'm Patricia Lindholm," the woman introduced herself. "I teach music at PS29's after-school program. We have a youth talent initiative. He should audition." Sarah hesitated. "I don't know if we could afford—" "It's publicly funded," Patricia interrupted, as if sensing her concern. "For children with exceptional ability." A week later, Sarah sat nervously in a school auditorium while Ethan auditioned. He looked tiny, seated at the full-sized grand piano, his feet barely reaching the pedals. The selection committee had asked him to play something of his choice, and he'd decided on a Chopin piece he'd learned by watching YouTube videos. As his small fingers began to move across the keys, Sarah held her breath. The piece was well beyond what most children his age could attempt, yet Ethan played with surprising fluidity, occasionally missing technical elements but capturing the emotional essence of the composition. When he finished, the room remained silent for several seconds. Then Patricia Lindholm spoke. "How long has he been taking lessons?" "He hasn't," Sarah admitted. "He taught himself by watching videos." The committee members exchanged significant glances. One of them, a stern-looking man with wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward. "Ms. Walker, your son has rare natural ability. With proper training, he could develop into something quite special." That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner in their small kitchen, her phone chimed with a news alert. Out of habit, she'd maintained her settings to track mentions of Richard Thompson in business publications. The headline made her pause. "Thompson Hotels expands to international markets with luxury property in Dubai." Against her better judgment, Sarah opened the article. There was Richard, looking polished and successful, cutting a ribbon at some opulent venue, his fiancée Catherine Carlton smiling beside him. The article praised his visionary leadership and impeccable timing in entering the Middle Eastern luxury market. Sarah set down her phone, a familiar mix of emotions washing over her: anger, hurt, and a renewed determination. Richard was expanding his inherited empire while she built something from nothing. The contrast couldn't have been starker. 3 days later, an envelope arrived from PS29. Inside was a letter offering Ethan admission to their selective music program with a 70% scholarship based on his exceptional audition. The remaining 30% of the tuition still represented a significant sum for Sarah's budget. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Sarah sat at her laptop reviewing Nightingale's finances. The platform was growing but not yet profitable. Mike's investment was carefully allocated to development and essential operations. The scholarship was generous, but the remaining tuition would stretch their household budget to the breaking point. For a moment, Sarah considered declining, perhaps waiting a year until Nightingale was more stable. Then she remembered the committee members' words, "Your son has rare natural ability." And Ms. Diaz, "I've never seen a child his age with such natural musical intuition." With resolution, Sarah opened her email and composed a message to the program director, accepting the offer and requesting payment plan options for the remaining tuition. She would find a way to make it work, even if it meant tightening their already lean budget further. The following week brought Ethan's first formal piano lesson. Sarah watched from the back of the classroom as her son sat at a proper piano, receiving instruction for the first time. His face glowed with concentration and delight as the teacher guided his hand positioning and explained musical notation, concepts he'd somehow intuited but never formally learned. "He's remarkable," the teacher told Sarah afterward. "He's already developed his own techniques to compensate for his lack of formal training. With proper guidance, there's no telling how far he could go." That night, as Sarah tucked an exhausted but happy Ethan into bed, he asked sleepily, "Am I good at piano, Mama?" Sarah smoothed his dark hair, her color, though the texture resembled Richard's. "You're more than good, sweetheart. You have a special gift." After Ethan fell asleep, Sarah sat at her own desk, working late on Nightingale's artist recruitment strategy. As she typed, her phone chimed with an email notification from a business publication she'd subscribed to. The subject line made her pause. "Fast Company seeks nominations for innovators to watch." Sarah stared at the screen, an idea forming. Nightingale was still small, but its model was genuinely innovative. With trembling fingers, she clicked the link and began filling out the nomination form, describing the platform's artist-first approach and transparent payment system. "This is crazy," she muttered as she hit submit. "They'll never select a tiny startup like Nightingale." But for the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where she wasn't just surviving but thriving, building something significant. One where Ethan's talent could flourish without financial constraints. One where, perhaps someday, Richard Thompson would open a magazine and see what had become of the woman he'd so callously discarded. While coloring the Fast Company article on her office wall, Sarah didn't realize that thousands of miles away, Richard Thompson was leafing through the same magazine on his private jet, stopping in surprise as he recognized the face of the ex-wife he had declared talentless next to the headline, "The Digital Music Revolutionary." Richard Thompson's words from the magazine echoed in Sarah's mind as she stared at her email inbox. The notification from Fast Company had arrived 3 weeks after her impulsive submission. "Congratulations, Sarah Walker. Nightingale Records has been selected for our Innovators to Watch feature." She read the email 4 times, each time expecting the words to rearrange themselves into a rejection. When they didn't, she covered her mouth to stifle a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Someone was watching. Someone important had noticed. Summer turned to fall, and fall to winter. The year 2015 arrived with Nightingale's first significant funding round, Series A financing that brought $3 million to expand the platform. The round was led by Artemis Ventures, a firm specializing in disruptive technology whose partners had discovered Nightingale through the Fast Company feature. "This is a watershed moment," Sarah explained to her team, now expanded to 15 people crowded into their modest Manhattan office. The original Brooklyn space had been outgrown within months of the Fast Company article. "This investment isn't just money, it's validation of our model." Raj, now Chief Technology Officer, raised a plastic cup of champagne. "To the founder who refused to compromise on her vision." The team cheered, their enthusiasm infectious. Sarah took a sip of champagne, the bubbles matching the effervescent feeling in her chest. $3 million. 3 years ago, she'd been collecting rainwater in cooking pots, feeding Ethan cut-up hot dogs, and debugging code until 3 in the morning. Now she led a company that serious investors believed could transform the music industry. When the modest celebration ended and the team dispersed, Sarah checked her watch. Just enough time to reach Ethan's music school for his recital. She grabbed her coat and the bouquet of flowers she'd hidden in the small office refrigerator. In the taxi crossing Manhattan, Sarah quickly changed from her presentation blazer into a more elegant blouse she'd brought for the occasion. Ethan, now 9, had become increasingly aware of appearances, noticing when other children's parents arrived in designer clothes and luxury vehicles. Sarah made sure she looked her best for his performances, regardless of how many budget meetings or investor pitches had filled her day. "We're running late," she told the driver. "Is there a faster route?" "Not at this hour, ma'am," he replied, gesturing to the gridlocked traffic ahead. Sarah checked her watch again and felt panic rising. In 4 years of Ethan's performances, she had never been late. Not once. This was her inviolable rule. No matter how demanding Nightingale became, Ethan's milestones came first. The taxi crawled through traffic for another 20 minutes before Sarah made a decision. "I'll get out here," she said, handing the driver cash. "It'll be faster if I run." Clutching the flowers and her change of shoes, Sarah sprinted 6 blocks in her business heels, ignoring the stares of pedestrians. She arrived at the prestigious music school's auditorium just as the lights were dimming, slipping into her reserved front-row seat seconds before the curtain rose. Ethan was 6th on the program, performing an original composition for the first time in a major school recital. As he walked onto the stage, tall for his age with Richard's bearing but Sarah's thoughtful expression, she felt the familiar mixture of pride and wistfulness. He grew more like his father in appearance with each passing year, yet his gentle spirit and creative soul were entirely his own. When he sat at the grand piano, a hush fell over the audience. His composition, titled simply "Mother," began with a delicate, questioning melody that gradually built into something more complex and resolute. Sarah recognized fragments of lullabies she had sung to him as a baby, woven into a sophisticated musical narrative that spoke of love, struggle, and perseverance. Tears slid silently down her cheeks as the piece reached its triumphant conclusion. The audience erupted in applause more enthusiastic than for any previous performer. Ethan stood and bowed formally, his eyes finding Sarah's in the front row. The smile they exchanged contained volumes of shared understanding. After the recital, as parents and students mingled in the reception area, a distinguished older man approached them. "Ms. Walker?" he inquired politely. "I'm Professor James Harrington from Juilliard's pre-college division." Sarah shook his extended hand. "A pleasure to meet you." "Your son's composition was extraordinary," Professor Harrington continued, his gaze shifting to Ethan, who stood slightly behind Sarah. "The technical elements were impressive, but more remarkable was the emotional maturity. It's rare to hear such authentic voice from someone so young." "Thank you, sir," Ethan replied with the quiet confidence he'd developed through years of performances. "Ethan should audition for our weekend program," Professor Harrington said, returning his attention to Sarah. "We work with exceptionally talented young musicians to prepare them for conservatory study." As he handed Sarah his card, she felt a moment of déjà vu, another doorway opening for Ethan, another opportunity that would stretch their resources but couldn't be ignored. "We'd be honored," she replied, already mentally calculating how to rearrange Nightingale's development timeline to accommodate Ethan's audition preparation. Spring of 2016 brought simultaneous growth for both Nightingale and Ethan. The platform expanded internationally, attracting artists from Europe and Asia who were drawn to its transparent model and artist-friendly terms. Meanwhile, Ethan was accepted into Juilliard's prestigious pre-college program, his audition leaving the judges visibly impressed. "He plays like someone who's lived several lifetimes," one evaluator commented. "There's an old soul quality to his interpretation." As Nightingale grew, so did Sarah's public profile. Music industry publications began featuring her in articles about digital disruption. Established record executives dismissed her in public while privately monitoring Nightingale's expanding influence. Artists who had been mistreated by traditional labels began reaching out directly, curious about the alternative she offered. Summer arrived with an unexpected opportunity. Leona James, a global superstar with 20 Grammy nominations and sales in the hundreds of millions, was embroiled in a bitter dispute with her record label over creative control of her upcoming album. Sarah was reviewing new feature specifications with her development team when her assistant interrupted. "I'm sorry, but there's a call you might want to take. It's from Leona James's management." The room fell silent. Everyone knew Leona. Her powerhouse vocals and uncompromising artistic vision had made her an icon. "Put it through to my office," Sarah replied, keeping her voice neutral despite the sudden acceleration of her pulse. In her modest office, Sarah took a deep breath before answering. "This is Sarah Walker." "Ms. Walker, I'm David Mercer, Leona James's manager," came the response. "Leona is interested in learning more about your platform." The conversation that followed was brief but surreal, David explaining that Leona had reached an impasse with Universal Records over her artistic direction and was exploring alternative release strategies. "She'd like to meet via video conference tomorrow if you're available," David concluded. "Of course," Sarah replied, maintaining professional composure while her mind raced with implications. The following day, Sarah sat at her desk, nervously straightening papers as her computer chimed with an incoming video call. When she accepted, Leona James's face filled the screen, the same face that graced billboards and magazine covers worldwide. "Sarah Walker," Leona said with a warm smile that contradicted her formidable reputation. "The woman who's giving record executives nightmares." Sarah laughed, tension breaking. "I think that's an exaggeration, but I'm flattered." "It's not," Leona countered. "I was at a label dinner last month where your name came up. The panic was palpable." She leaned closer to the camera. "That's when I knew I needed to talk to you." Over the next hour, Leona explained her situation. Her label wanted commercial radio hits while she had created a deeply personal concept album. After months of fighting, she was considering extreme options. "They own my previous recordings but not my future," Leona explained. "I've read about your model. 90% to the artist, transparency, direct connection with fans. Is that real?" "Completely real," Sarah confirmed. "We believe artists should control their work and receive fair compensation." Leona's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "And if someone like me released exclusively through Nightingale, could your servers handle millions of simultaneous downloads?" Sarah hesitated, unwilling to oversell Nightingale's capabilities. "We'd need to scale up significantly, but with proper preparation, yes." The negotiation that followed stretched over weeks, involving technical assessments, legal reviews, and intense planning sessions. Sarah pulled all-nighters with her development team, preparing Nightingale's infrastructure for traffic levels they'd never anticipated facing so soon. In July, the announcement stunned the music industry. Leona James to release new album exclusively via Nightingale, departing major label after 15 years. The reaction was seismic. Music publications scrambled to explain Nightingale to mainstream audiences. Industry executives issued dismissive statements while privately making panicked calls. Competing platforms rushed to court other dissatisfied artists before Nightingale could reach them. On release day, Sarah and her team gathered in their office, monitoring servers as Leona's album went live. Within minutes, traffic surged beyond their most optimistic projections. "We're at 200% of expected volume," Raj reported, eyes fixed on performance metrics. "Servers are holding, but we're reaching capacity limits." Sarah watched the numbers climb with equal parts excitement and terror. This was Nightingale's moment of truth. Succeed, and they would cement their place in the industry. Fail, and they might never recover from the public embarrassment. "Add the backup cluster," she ordered, authorizing the emergency expenditure they'd prepared for this scenario. For 12 hours, the team worked continuously, scaling systems, optimizing code, and keeping the platform stable as millions of Leona's fans created accounts and purchased the album. By midnight, they had processed more transactions than in Nightingale's entire previous existence. "We did it," Raj announced finally, allowing himself to collapse into his chair. Not a single minute of downtime. The following morning, Sarah awoke to a flood of notifications. Nightingale had reached #1 in the App Store. Leona's album was breaking streaming records. And most significantly, music publications were leading with headlines like, "The Label Killer, How Nightingale is Rewriting Music Industry Rules." Sarah's phone rang as she was reviewing the overnight reports. It was Ethan's piano instructor. "Ms. Walker, I'm calling about Ethan's composition for the fall showcase," the instructor began. "He's submitted a symphonic piece that's frankly beyond what we typically see from students his age. It would require a full orchestra." "Is that a problem?" Sarah asked, concern creeping into her voice. "Not a problem, but an opportunity. The director of Juilliard's orchestral program heard Ethan's demo recording and wants to feature it in their December performance. This is unprecedented for a pre-college student." As Sarah hung up, a notification appeared on her screen. A Fast Company alert featuring Nightingale's success with Leona's album. The article concluded, "Sarah Walker has proven that her artist-first approach isn't just idealistic rhetoric, but a viable business model that could transform how music reaches audiences." That evening, Sarah and Ethan celebrated both their successes with takeout pizza in their modest apartment. The Fast Company article was pinned to the refrigerator alongside the letter from Juilliard about Ethan's symphony. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Ethan said suddenly, his voice taking on the slight deepening of pre-adolescence. "For building Nightingale the way you wanted, not the way everyone said you should." Sarah smiled, reaching across to squeeze his hand. "And I'm beyond proud of you. Your symphony at Juilliard. That's extraordinary." As she placed the Fast Company article in a folder of significant Nightingale milestones, Sarah didn't realize that thousands of miles away, Richard Thompson was leafing through the same magazine on his private jet, stopping in surprise as he recognized the face of the ex-wife he had declared talentless next to the headline, "The Digital Music Revolutionary." Richard Thompson stared at the magazine in his hand, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the glossy pages. There she was, Sarah Walker, smiling confidently from the Fast Company feature, the headline proclaiming her the digital music revolutionary. His ex-wife, the woman he'd dismissed as talentless, was now being celebrated as an industry innovator. "Sir, we'll be landing in Dubai in 20 minutes, his pilot announced over the intercom. Richard barely nodded, his eyes fixed on Sarah's image. She looked different, polished, confident, successful. Nothing like the frightened, pregnant woman he'd evicted from his penthouse 7 years ago. According to the article, her company Nightingale Records had experienced unprecedented growth following Leona James's exclusive album release. The private jet began its descent, but Richard couldn't tear his eyes from the magazine. He'd been monitoring Sarah's unlikely rise peripherally through business publications, but had dismissed Nightingale as a minor player, a curiosity that would soon collapse under established industry pressure. This feature suggested otherwise. 3,000 miles away in Manhattan, Sarah was experiencing the surreal sensation of having too much office space. Nightingale's new headquarters occupied 2 full floors in a gleaming midtown building, a necessary expansion following their explosive growth after Leona's album release. "The development team needs the entire East Wing," explained Marcus, her newly hired operations director, as they toured the space, "and we've allocated the southwest corner for your executive office." Sarah paused at the floor-to-ceiling windows. The view of Manhattan stretched before her, skyscrapers catching the morning light. Just 3 years ago, she'd been working from a tiny Brooklyn office with only Raj and 2 part-time employees. Now she led a team of 80 with expansion plans for offices in London and Seoul. "Ms. Walker?" Marcus prompted. "Is the office location acceptable?" "It's perfect," she replied, turning from the window. "But let's convert half of it into a soundproof studio where artists can record demos when they visit. I don't need that much space." That evening, Sarah took a taxi uptown to the Upper East Side, where she and Ethan had recently moved into a spacious 3-bedroom apartment. The doorman greeted her by name as she entered the elegant lobby, a far cry from the walk-ups and basement apartments of their past. "Mom, come look!" Ethan called the moment she opened the door. Now 12, he stood nearly to her shoulder, his lanky frame and aristocratic features increasingly reminiscent of Richard. He led her to the living room where a gleaming grand piano now occupied the corner space that had been empty that morning. "It was delivered this afternoon," Ethan explained, his eyes bright with excitement. "The card says it's from Juilliard, a scholarship gift for the most promising young composer in our program." Sarah ran her hand over the polished ebony surface, momentarily speechless. This instrument cost more than her entire annual income during those early struggling years. "You've earned this," she said finally, embracing her son. "I'm so proud of you." Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed following hours at his new piano, Sarah sat in their living room with a glass of wine, reviewing the latest Nightingale metrics on her tablet. The platform now hosted over 12,000 artists and nearly 4 million monthly active users. Fast Company had named her Innovator of the Year 2 months prior, and just last week, Forbes had requested an interview for a potential cover story. Success had come faster than she'd ever imagined, bringing security and comfort beyond what she'd dared to hope during those desperate early days. Yet beneath the professional triumph lay a more personal satisfaction. She had proven Richard wrong in every conceivable way. The following morning brought news that the Forbes piece would indeed be the cover story. "They want to photograph you at the office and with Ethan if that's comfortable," her publicist explained. "They're framing it as the woman revolutionizing how artists get paid." The photo session took place the following week. Sarah, dressed in a tailored Alexander McQueen suit, a far cry from the threadbare clothes of her basement apartment days, posed confidently in Nightingale's sleek headquarters. The photographer directed her through various setups, examining analytics on a large screen, conferring with her executive team, standing thoughtfully by the window with Manhattan spread below. "Beautiful," the photographer praised. "You project strength without arrogance. It's refreshing." Later, They photographed Sarah and Ethan at a piano in Nightingale's studio space, his fingers poised over the keys as she looked on with pride. At 12, Ethan was already gaining recognition in classical music circles. His first symphony had been performed by the youth orchestra at Lincoln Center, and he was working on his second, more ambitious composition. When the Forbes issue was published 3 weeks later, the cover exceeded Sarah's expectations. Under the headline, "From Homeless to Hotshot: How Sarah Walker Built a $800 million Music Empire," she appeared confident and serene, the Manhattan skyline visible through the window behind her. The article detailed Nightingale's meteoric rise and Sarah's unconventional journey, though she had been careful to keep Richard's name out of her narrative, referring only to a difficult divorce that left her pregnant and homeless. The piece concluded with industry analysts predicting Nightingale would reach unicorn status, a billion-dollar valuation, within the year. As 2019 began, Sarah faced a new challenge: competing acquisition offers. Apple, Spotify, and Google had all expressed interest in purchasing Nightingale, with preliminary offers ranging from $1 to $3 billion. "This is what success looks like," her board chairman said during a closed-door meeting. "Building something valuable enough that the giants want to buy it." Sarah listened to the acquisition arguments with growing unease. The numbers were staggering. She could become a billionaire overnight, securing Ethan's future and validating her business acumen to the world. Yet selling Nightingale felt like betraying its founding mission. "I appreciate the perspective," she said finally, "but I built Nightingale to be different, to serve artists rather than exploit them. I'm not convinced these potential acquirers share that vision." Her resolve was tested 2 weeks later when Apple increased its offer to $5 billion. For 3 sleepless nights, Sarah wrestled with the decision, making lists of pros and cons, consulting trusted advisors, and ultimately sitting alone on her balcony overlooking Central Park, asking herself what success truly meant. On the 4th morning, she called an emergency board meeting and announced her decision. "Nightingale is not for sale. Not to Apple, not to anyone. Our mission matters more than an exit strategy." 2 board members resigned in protest, but Sarah stood firm. The tech press buzzed with speculation about her decision to reject one of the largest acquisition offers in music tech history. Meanwhile, across the country in Chicago, the Thompson Hotel Group was facing unprecedented challenges. The post-pandemic travel collapse had hit luxury hotels particularly hard, and a series of ill-timed expansions had left the company over-leveraged. Financial publications began running stories questioning the company's future, with headlines like, "Thompson Hotels, a dynasty in decline." Richard Thompson, now divorced from his second wife following a tabloid-worthy scandal involving his executive assistant, found himself fighting to preserve his family legacy. The irony wasn't lost on him that while his empire teetered, Sarah Walker's creation flourished, her face appearing regularly in business publications that once featured only him. His fascination with her success became an obsession. He set Google alerts for her name, subscribed to publications that might feature her, and even directed his assistant to compile reports on Nightingale's business developments. During particularly difficult board meetings, he would find himself wondering how Sarah had managed to build something so valuable from nothing while he struggled to maintain what had been handed to him. One evening, after a particularly brutal day of refinancing negotiations, Richard found himself studying photos of Ethan from a recent feature on young musical prodigies. The boy, now 13, had composed a symphony that was being performed by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's youth program. In the accompanying photo, Ethan sat at a piano, his profile hauntingly familiar, the same jawline Richard saw in childhood photos of himself, the same intense concentration in his eyes. Richard called for his driver and traveled to the Symphony Center, purchasing a ticket to the performance under an assumed name. From the back of the auditorium, he watched as his biological son conducted his own composition, the audience responding with a standing ovation. The program noted that Ethan Walker was the youngest composer ever featured in the CSO Youth Series. Afterward, Richard lingered outside, watching from a distance as Sarah and Ethan emerged, surrounded by well-wishers. The boy was tall for his age, with Richard's bearing but softer features that must have come from Sarah. She looked elegant in a simple black dress, accepting compliments on Ethan's behalf with gracious modesty. Something tightened in Richard's chest. Regret, perhaps, or the belated recognition of what he had carelessly discarded. He had rejected them both, certain they had nothing of value to offer his world. Now they moved in rarefied circles on their own merit, while his carefully constructed life showed cracks in its foundation. The following week, Richard hired a private investigator to compile a comprehensive report on Sarah and Ethan. The dossier arrived 3 days later. Photographs, press clippings, public records, and background information that painted a picture of their lives since he had expelled them from his. The investigator's clinical summary struck Richard like a physical blow. Subject EW demonstrates exceptional musical ability consistent with prodigy classification. Currently enrolled at Juilliard pre-college program with full scholarship. Compositions performed at Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, and Kennedy Center. Subject SW has built Nightingale records from startup to industry disruptor valued at approximately $9 billion. Recently declined acquisition offer of $5 billion from Apple Inc. That night, Richard stood at the window of his Chicago penthouse, a glass of scotch in hand, staring at the city lights below. Everything he had assumed about Sarah and her capabilities had been catastrophically wrong. The woman he had dismissed as talentless and insignificant had built something more valuable than anything he had ever created, while raising a son of extraordinary ability, a son who should have carried the Thompson name. The Forbes magazine with Sarah's cover story lay open on his desk. In the photo, she looked directly into the camera with quiet confidence, a woman who had nothing to prove and no one to impress. Richard traced the outline of her face with his finger, wondering how he could have been so blind to her potential, so casually cruel in his dismissal. As 2020 arrived with the chaos of a global pandemic, Nightingale thrived while traditional music industry models collapsed. With concerts canceled worldwide, artists turned to digital distribution as their primary revenue source, and Nightingale's artist-friendly terms attracted thousands of new creators to the platform. Sarah, now working from the Upper East Side penthouse she had purchased as a pandemic refuge for her family, watched Nightingale's valuation soar past $3 billion. Meanwhile, Ethan, 15 and already accepted early to Juilliard's undergraduate program, composed music that critics described as transcending his years. When the invitation to the American Business Awards arrived in Sarah's email, she hesitated before accepting. The gala at the Metropolitan Opera House would mark her first major in-person event since the pandemic restrictions had eased. As a nominee for Businesswoman of the Year, her attendance was expected, but something about the event triggered an uneasiness she couldn't identify. The guest list, when it arrived 2 weeks before the ceremony, explained her intuition. Among the hundreds of names of business leaders and influencers, one stood out like a flare in darkness: Richard Thompson, representing Thompson Luxury Hotels. Sarah stared at the name, a complex surge of emotions washing over her. 15 years had passed since he had cruelly expelled her from his life. 15 years of struggle, determination, and ultimately, triumph. Now fate had arranged for their paths to cross at the precise moment of her greatest professional recognition. As Sarah prepared for the gala in her penthouse, selecting a custom Versace gown and subtle diamond jewelry, she realized with sudden clarity that she felt no fear at the prospect of seeing Richard again, only a calm certainty that the universe had a peculiar sense of justice. At that moment, thousands of miles away, Richard Thompson was leafing through the same magazine on his private jet, stopping in surprise as he recognized the face of the ex-wife he had declared talentless, next to the headline, "The Digital Music Revolutionary." The name on the guest list seemed to glow against the stark white background of Sarah's tablet. Richard Thompson. She stared at it, her finger hovering above the screen as if the name might somehow disappear if she touched it. After 15 years, their paths would intersect in the most public of settings, the American Business Awards at the Metropolitan Opera House. "Is everything okay?" Melissa, her assistant, asked from the doorway of Sarah's office. Sarah looked up, composing her expression into professional neutrality. "Yes, just reviewing the final guest list for tomorrow night." After Melissa left, Sarah allowed herself to lean back in her chair, memories flooding back unbidden. The night Richard had thrown her out, the months of struggle that followed, the leaky basement apartment, the hunger, the fear. Each memory now seemed like scenes from someone else's life, painful but distant, like watching a film about a stranger's hardships. She closed her tablet and gazed out at the Manhattan skyline from her corner office. Nightingale Records now occupied 3 floors of prime real estate, its value exceeding $3 billion. The journey from that night in Chicago to this moment seemed impossible, yet here she was. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Finished rehearsal early. Coming by the office. Need anything?" Sarah smiled. At 15, Ethan had grown into a remarkable young man, talented, thoughtful, and mercifully unaware of the truth about his father. She had kept her promise to herself, planning to tell him the full story when he turned 18. Now, with Richard's imminent appearance at the awards, that timeline might need acceleration. 20 minutes later, Ethan walked into her office, his tall frame and confident stride increasingly reminiscent of Richard. The resemblance sometimes caught Sarah off guard. The same blue eyes, the same jawline, though softened by her features. "How was rehearsal?" she asked, embracing him briefly. "Professor Levine says the third movement needs work," Ethan replied, dropping his messenger bag onto a chair. "But he thinks the symphony will be ready for the premiere next month." He studied her face with unexpected intensity. "You seem tense. Is it about tomorrow's award?" Sarah considered deflecting but decided on a partial truth. "The guest list includes someone from my past, someone I haven't seen in a very long time." "An ex?" Ethan asked with the directness of adolescence. "Yes," she admitted. "From before you were born." Ethan shrugged with teenage nonchalance. "Will seeing him bother you?" "Not in the way you might think," Sarah replied carefully. "It's complicated." "Most things worth talking about are," he said with surprising wisdom. Then, with a swift change of subject characteristic of his age, "Can we order sushi for dinner? I'm starving." That evening, in her Upper East Side penthouse, Sarah stood before her closet considering her options for the following night. The awards ceremony demanded something extraordinary, not just for the cameras or the industry peers, but now for a more personal audience. Her stylist had delivered several options, but Sarah's hand went immediately to the midnight blue Versace. The gown was elegantly understated at first glance, but magnificent in its details, hand-embroidered with subtle silver thread that caught the light like distant stars. It projected quiet confidence rather than desperate attention-seeking. "That one," said Ethan from the doorway, now in sweatpants and a Juilliard t-shirt. "It looks like you." Sarah smiled. "How does a 15-year-old boy know anything about evening gowns?" "I know my mom," he replied simply. "You don't need to try too hard. You never have." The next morning brought final preparations. Sarah's hair and makeup team arrived at 10, transforming her into the polished CEO the world expected. The stylist made last-minute adjustments to the gown. Her security team confirmed transportation arrangements and reviewed protocols for the red carpet arrival. Through it all, Sarah maintained outward calm, though her thoughts repeatedly drifted to Richard. Would he have aged well? Would he recognize her immediately? Would his face betray any reaction to seeing the woman he had once discarded now celebrated as an industry titan? "Are you nervous about tonight?" Ethan asked as they shared a light lunch. "Curious would be a better word," Sarah replied. "The music industry has changed dramatically since Nightingale launched. Tonight represents acknowledgement of that change." "You're deflecting," Ethan observed with a slight smile. But that's okay. You've earned whatever feelings you have. By 6 o'clock, Sarah was dressed and ready, the Versace gown complemented by simple diamond studs and a single platinum bracelet. Ethan, handsome in his first custom tuxedo, stood beside her in the elevator descending to the waiting limousine. "You look beautiful, Mom," he said as the doors opened, "and terrifying in the best possible way." Sarah laughed, the tension breaking momentarily. Terrifying wasn't the goal, but I'll take it. The ride to Lincoln Center passed in comfortable silence, Sarah occasionally checking her phone for last-minute messages from her team. As the limousine approached the Metropolitan Opera House, the flashing lights of photographers became visible through the tinted windows. "Remember, you don't have to answer any questions you don't want to," Sarah reminded Ethan. "Just smile and keep walking if you prefer." "I know," he replied calmly. "This isn't my first red carpet." The limousine stopped, and Sarah took a deep breath as her security detail opened the door. Instantly, the muted evening erupted into sound and light, photographers calling her name, reporters thrusting microphones forward, fans behind barricades cheering. "Sarah Walker, over here!" "Sarah, how does it feel being nominated for Businesswoman of the Year? Is it true Apple offered $5 billion for Nightingale last month?" Sarah navigated the chaos with practiced ease, answering select questions while guiding Ethan through the gauntlet with a protective hand on his back. His height now matched hers in heels, a fact that continually surprised her. Inside the opulent lobby, the noise diminished to a sophisticated murmur as business elites networked over champagne. Sarah accepted a flute from a passing waiter, scanning the room automatically for familiar faces, industry colleagues, competitors, potential partners. And then, like a scene from a dream where time slows to an excruciating crawl, she saw him. Richard Thompson stood approximately 20 meters away, his back half turned to her as he conversed with a group of men in similar tuxedos. At 45, he remained handsome, though his once lean frame had thickened slightly, and his dark hair now showed distinguished touches of silver at the temples. Beside him stood a strikingly beautiful blonde woman, significantly younger, displaying an enormous engagement ring that caught the chandelier light with each animated gesture. Sarah felt a curious emptiness where she had expected emotion, neither vindication nor anger, just calm observation. This man had once defined her world, then shattered it. Now he seemed remarkably ordinary. As if sensing her gaze, Richard turned slightly, his eyes sweeping the room in a practiced social scan. When his gaze met Sarah's, the change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. First confusion, then shock, then something more complex that settled into a pale mask of recognition. For several heartbeats, they simply looked at each other across the crowded space, 15 years of unspoken history suspended between them. Sarah didn't smile or nod, merely held his gaze steadily until he broke the connection, turning abruptly back to his companions. "Mom, that man is staring at you," Ethan whispered, having noticed the exchange. Sarah maintained her composure, though her heart raced with the knowledge that Richard had seen not only her, but also Ethan, the son he had rejected before birth, now standing tall beside her. "It's just someone I knew a long time ago," she replied calmly. "Nothing important." The announcement requesting guests to take their seats provided welcome interruption. Sarah was escorted to the front section reserved for nominees and special guests, while Richard, she noted peripherally, was seated several rows back, a subtle but clear indication of their respective positions in the current business hierarchy. Throughout the lavish dinner preceding the awards, Sarah engaged effortlessly with the prominent executives at her table, discussing Nightingale's latest innovations and the future of digital distribution. Occasionally, she felt Richard's gaze from across the room, but didn't acknowledge it. "The CEO of Spotify is trying to get your attention," Ethan murmured, nodding subtly toward a balding man 2 tables away who had been attempting to catch Sarah's eye. Sarah smiled and nodded in acknowledgement. He's been trying to arrange a partnership meeting for months." "And that's the guy from before, isn't it?" Ethan added casually, his eyes flickering briefly toward Richard's table. "The one who keeps looking over here." Before Sarah could respond, the lights dimmed and the master of ceremonies approached the podium to begin the awards presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the American Business Awards, celebrating excellence and innovation across industries." The ceremony proceeded with predictable elegance, video packages highlighting nominees, polite applause for winners, acceptance speeches carefully balanced between gratitude and self-promotion. Sarah listened attentively, applauding colleagues, her mind occasionally drifting to the man seated rows behind her, wondering what thoughts might be circulating behind his impassive expression. "And now," announced the Master of Ceremonies, "we come to our final award of the evening, Businesswoman of the Year, recognizing not just extraordinary financial success, but innovation that redefines entire industries." The large screens throughout the venue began playing a video highlighting the Nightingale Records journey. Starting with just $10,000 in 2011, Sarah Walker revolutionized how artists distribute music, eliminating intermediaries and returning creative and financial power to musicians. Today, Nightingale processes 43% of all independent music consumed globally, with 87 million active users. The camera found Sarah in the audience, her face projected on screens throughout the venue as the narrator continued. But perhaps more remarkable than these numbers is the philosophy behind them, a commitment to transparency, artist ownership, and fair compensation that has forced an entire industry to reconsider practices unchanged for decades. As the video concluded, Sarah felt Ethan squeeze her hand. The gesture centered her, reminding her of what truly mattered, not Richard's belated recognition, but the journey she and her son had traveled together. And the award for Businesswoman of the Year goes to Sarah Walker, founder and CEO of Nightingale Records. The audience rose in thunderous applause as Sarah made her way to the stage, conscious of her posture, her expression, the symbolism of this moment. She accepted the Crystal Award with grace, taking a moment to gather her thoughts before addressing the audience. 15 years ago, she began, her voice clear and steady. "I slept on a friend's sofa, pregnant and abandoned, with $200 in my bank account and a dream that seemed impossible. I was informed in unequivocal terms that my talent was mediocre, my vision insignificant, and my future without value." A hushed stillness fell over the audience, the unexpected personal revelation creating immediate intimacy in the vast space. This award belongs to every person who has been underestimated, discarded, considered insufficient. To every woman who has been told she doesn't belong in the rooms where decisions are made. To every artist who has been exploited by a system designed to enrich executives, not creators. Her eyes found Richard's for the briefest moment before continuing, her voice gaining strength. Nightingale was born not from a desire for revenge, but from the conviction that there was a better way. We revolutionized the music industry not by breaking rules, but by creating new ones based on transparency, equity, and respect for creative talent. When Sarah concluded her speech, the ovation was deafening. Ethan rushed to embrace her as she descended from the stage, tears of pride shining in his eyes. While the applause still echoed, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that somewhere in that audience, Richard Thompson was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had so carelessly discarded 15 years ago. The post-award reception filled with the gentle hum of important conversations and the clink of crystal. Sarah circulated through the crowd, accepting congratulations with gracious nods, her Crystal Award temporarily entrusted to her assistant for safekeeping. Photographers continued to capture her in candid moments, documenting her triumph for tomorrow's business pages. Ethan had disappeared momentarily toward the dessert table, leaving Sarah briefly alone when she felt a presence approach from behind. She knew who it was before turning, some primal sense recognizing him even after 15 years. Sarah. Richard's voice carried the same authoritative timbre she remembered, though now tinged with unmistakable nervousness. Congratulations on the award. Your success is extraordinary. She turned, meeting his gaze directly. The years had treated Richard well on the surface, his hair now distinguished with silver at the temples, his tuxedo impeccably tailored. Yet something in his eyes suggested strain beneath the polished exterior. "Richard," she replied with professional politeness, neither warm nor cold. "Thank you. How are the Thompson hotels? I heard about the bankruptcy proceedings in Chicago and Miami." The subtle jab landed precisely as intended. Richard swallowed visibly, his confident facade momentarily slipping. "Challenging times for the hospitality sector," he recovered quickly. "But we're restructuring. The Thompson name still carries significant weight in luxury markets." He hesitated, his eyes flickering past her shoulder. "Sarah, I didn't know you had continued with the pregnancy." The statement hung between them, 15 years compressed into a single confession of ignorance. "Did you imagine I would follow your suggestion?" Sarah asked, her voice steady. "That I would simply erase our child because it was inconvenient for your image?" Richard's gaze dropped momentarily. "I wasn't in a place to be a father then. My priorities were—" He trailed off, perhaps realizing how hollow any explanation would sound. "Your priorities were perfectly clear," Sarah replied. The conversation paused as Ethan approached, balancing 2 small plates of dessert. "Mom, they have that chocolate thing you like," he said, offering her one of the plates before noticing Richard. "Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt." Sarah's heart constricted, watching Richard's eyes widen slightly as he took in Ethan up close, the unmistakable Thompson features now impossible to deny. "You're not interrupting," she assured Ethan. "This is Richard Thompson, an old acquaintance. Richard, my son Ethan, first year at Juilliard, Department of Composition." Richard extended a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ethan. Juilliard is impressive for someone so young." "Thank you," Ethan replied with the polite disinterest of a teenager meeting one of his mother's business contacts, entirely unaware of the momentous nature of this introduction. Richard seemed physically unable to look away from the boy, his eyes cataloging each familiar feature. "He is extraordinarily talented, I imagine." "Symphony No. 3 being performed by the New York Philharmonic next month," Sarah responded, allowing a hint of maternal pride into her voice. "Tickets have been sold out for weeks." Richard nodded, visibly struggling to maintain composure. "I always appreciated classical music, though I lack the talent to create it." The words seemed directed at Ethan, a desperate attempt to establish some connection. "Most people do," Ethan replied without arrogance, simply stating fact. "Creating music requires technical skill and emotional intelligence in equal measure." Before Richard could respond, a striking blonde woman in her early 30s approached, slipping her arm possessively through his. "Darling, you disappeared," she pouted, her gaze curious as she assessed Sarah and Ethan. "Cassandra, this is Sarah Walker, CEO of Nightingale Records," Richard introduced mechanically. "Sarah, my fiancée, Cassandra Pierce." Recognition flashed across Cassandra's perfectly maintained features. "The Sarah Walker? Forbes said you turned down a $5 billion offer from Apple." $6 billion, actually," Sarah corrected gently. "But Nightingale isn't for sale. Our mission matters more than an exit strategy." Cassandra's eyes widened appreciatively. "That's incredible. Richard always says true conviction in business is rare. He must have known you'd be successful when you two were—" She hesitated, suddenly uncertain of their past connection. "Acquainted," Sarah supplied smoothly. "Richard and I knew each other briefly in Chicago many years ago." Richard's expression suggested he was enduring physical pain, trapped between his past and present. A Wall Street Journal photographer approached the group, camera raised. "Ms. Walker, could I get a photo of tonight's winner with her family?" the photographer asked. "Of course," Sarah agreed, positioning herself beside Ethan. "Mr. Thompson, Could you step aside? Just the family in the photo, the photographer requested casually. The comment struck Richard like a physical blow. He stepped back, murmuring apologies while Cassandra watched the exchange with growing confusion. The camera flashed, capturing Sarah and Ethan, mother and son, a complete family unit without him. As the evening began winding down, guests gradually dispersed toward waiting cars. Sarah and Ethan were preparing to leave when Richard made one final desperate approach near the elevators, having momentarily detached from Cassandra. "Sarah, could we speak privately? Please. There's so much I need to say." His voice had lost its practiced confidence, revealing something raw and urgent beneath. Sarah regarded him with a complex mixture of emotions, not hatred or anger, but something closer to pity, mixed with indifference. "I believe you said everything 15 years ago, Richard. Some words can't be withdrawn. I know, but he's my son." Richard lowered his voice, glancing toward Ethan, who stood several yards away, texting on his phone. "I have rights." "Rights?" Sarah interrupted, her tone still calm but razor-sharp. "You signed documents renouncing any rights. Documents your lawyers drafted meticulously." Richard stepped closer, desperation evident. "I was a different person then. I made a terrible mistake. Sarah, look at him. He's my blood." "He is my son," Sarah countered firmly. "The blood he carries is irrelevant to the character he's built, the talent he's developed, the man he's becoming. You chose not to be part of that." Richard's composure cracked entirely, revealing the panic beneath. He grasped Sarah's arm, his grip just tight enough to betray his emotional state. "Please, Sarah. The Thompson hotels are struggling. We could find common ground, perhaps a partnership, a chance for me to know my son and—" Sarah removed his hand calmly but firmly. "I understand now. This isn't about Ethan at all, is it? It's about saving your failing empire." Realization dawned in her eyes. 15 years ago, you told me I had no value. Today you discover I'm worth billions more than you. What perfect irony. Richard paled. "That's not fair. I admit I was wrong about you, catastrophically wrong, but I have a right to know my son." "You had that right 15 years ago," Sarah replied. "You signed it away for $200,000 and a confidentiality agreement. Ethan deserves better than a father who suddenly discovers his existence when it might be financially advantageous." "Is everything okay?" Ethan approached, sensing tension despite being out of earshot. "Everything's fine," Sarah assured him. "Mr. Thompson was just leaving." Richard looked desperately between them, opening his mouth to speak before apparently thinking better of it. "Congratulations again on your award, Sarah," he finally managed, attempting to salvage some dignity. "Ethan, it was truly a pleasure to meet you." With that, he retreated toward Cassandra, who waited by the main exit, her expression suggesting questions would follow. In the limousine heading uptown, Ethan broke the silence. "That man, Richard Thompson. There was something weird about how he looked at me." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "What do you mean?" "I don't know." Ethan frowned, like he was trying to figure something out. "And the way you two talked, it seemed tense." Sarah considered her response carefully. "Richard and I have a complicated history." "Was he more than an acquaintance?" Ethan asked perceptively. Sarah took a deep breath. "Yes, but that's a longer conversation, one we should have soon." She reached for his hand. "Not tonight, though. Tonight is for celebrating." Ethan nodded, accepting the temporary deflection. "You were amazing up there, Mom. When you talked about being abandoned and pregnant, was that about my father?" The directness of the question caught Sarah off guard. She'd always known this moment would come, had prepared for it, yet the reality felt overwhelming. "Yes," she answered simply. "It was." Ethan absorbed this information silently as the limousine glided through Manhattan's glittering streets. "Will you tell me about him someday? The whole story?" "Very soon," Sarah promised. "You deserve to know everything." The following morning, Sarah woke to her phone buzzing incessantly. Melissa had sent multiple urgent messages with links to the Wall Street Journal and other publications. The headline made her sit upright. Confrontation at Met Opera. Billionaire CEO Sarah Walker and ex-husband who abandoned her pregnant have tense encounter. The article featured a photograph of her and Richard mid-conversation, their body language telling a story more eloquent than words. The journalist had apparently captured fragments of their final exchange, and sources had confirmed the history of Sarah's abandonment 15 years earlier. By noon, the story had gone viral, dominating business news and spreading to mainstream media. Sarah watched from her office as CNBC ran a segment analyzing the dramatic reunion and its potential impact on both companies' stock prices. Thompson Hotels had already dropped 17% since market opening. Richard Thompson has canceled all public appearances for the week, Melissa reported, entering with the latest updates. His publicist issued a no-comment statement, and Ethan is on line 3. Sarah's heart sank. She had hoped to control the narrative, to tell Ethan on her own terms. Now that choice had been taken from her. She took a deep breath before picking up the phone. "Hi, sweetheart." "Mom." Ethan's voice sounded strange, controlled and distant. "I'm seeing the news. That man, Richard Thompson, is my father?" Sarah closed her eyes briefly. "Yes. I was planning to tell you when you turned 18. I'm sorry you had to find out this way." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unasked questions. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because he chose not to be part of our lives, Ethan. He threw me out when I was pregnant, said I had no talent or value, and offered money for me to abort you. Later, he signed documents renouncing any parental rights." Another long silence followed. "I see." Two simple words that couldn't possibly convey the complexity of what her son must be feeling. "Do you want to come home?" Sarah asked gently. "We can talk about everything." "I need some time to process this," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I'll call you later." As she hung up, Sarah felt an unexpected sense of calm. The truth she'd carried for 15 years was finally in the open. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as they always had. While Sarah was navigating the personal fallout of the public revelation, Richard Thompson sat in his Plaza Hotel apartment, watching his professional life crumble in real time. The stock was in freefall, the board was demanding emergency meetings, and his fiancée had stormed out after a volatile argument about his concealed past. His assistant announced through the intercom, "Sir, Sarah Walker is here." Richard paused at the sound of Sarah's name, looking momentarily disoriented as he glanced toward the intercom. "Send her in," he managed, straightening his disheveled appearance as best he could. The opulent Plaza Hotel suite, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a gilded cage. Newspapers lay scattered across the coffee table, each headline more damaging than the last. His phone had been buzzing relentlessly with calls from board members, shareholders, and crisis management consultants, all ignored for the moment. When Sarah entered, Richard was struck by the contrast between them. Despite the media storm, she looked composed, her simple black pantsuit radiating quiet authority. He, meanwhile, had abandoned his jacket and tie, his rumpled shirt suggesting a man unraveling. "I didn't expect to see you," he said, attempting to regain some semblance of his usual confidence. "I'm here because Ethan asked me to come," Sarah replied, declining his gestured invitation to sit. "He wants to meet you." Richard froze, disbelief washing over his features. "He wants to meet me? After everything that's come out?" "My son has a natural curiosity and a generous heart, qualities he didn't inherit from you." Sarah's tone remained measured. "He desires to understand his own history." Hope flared in Richard's eyes. "Sarah, I don't know how to thank you." "I'm not doing this for you," she interrupted. "I'm doing this for him. And there are conditions." Sarah outlined her terms without room for negotiation. Meetings would be supervised initially. Richard would make no attempt to use Ethan for publicity or to access her business. There would be no extravagant gifts or attempts to buy affection. And most importantly, Richard would have no parental authority or input into decisions about Ethan's life. You are, at best, a biological connection with whom he may choose to develop some type of relationship, Sarah concluded. If you cause him any emotional harm, you will disappear permanently. Is that clear? Richard nodded, uncharacteristically subdued. Crystal clear. I just want a chance to know him. One more thing, Sarah added. I saw how you looked at me last night when you mentioned Thompson Hotel's struggles. To be absolutely clear, there will never be a business relationship between us. Nightingale will never invest in, partner with, or rescue your company. This is solely about Ethan's wish to understand his origins. The following week, Richard waited at a small cafe in Central Park, having arrived 30 minutes early out of anxiety. He'd changed outfits 3 times that morning, eventually selecting casual attire, expensive but understated, hoping to appear approachable rather than intimidating. When Sarah and Ethan appeared on the path, Richard felt his heart race. Seeing his son walking toward him, tall, confident, unmistakably carrying Thompson jeans, was overwhelming. He stood, awkwardly smoothing his shirt. "Hello," he managed, his typical boardroom confidence nowhere to be found. "Ethan wanted to meet in a public place," Sarah explained, her hand protectively on her son's shoulder. "I'll be at that table over there." As she stepped away, Richard found himself alone with Ethan for the first time. The teenager studied him with unsettling directness, his gaze analytical rather than emotional. "So," Ethan began, sitting across from Richard, "you're the man who abandoned my mother." The bluntness of the statement caught Richard off guard. "Yes," he admitted after a moment's hesitation. "I made the greatest mistake of my life." "Why?" The single word hung between them, demanding an answer that no explanation could adequately provide. Richard considered deflecting, offering excuses about youth or circumstances, but something in Ethan's steady gaze, so reminiscent of Sarah's, demanded honesty. "Because I was arrogant, foolish, and cowardly. Because I thought status and money were more important than people. Because I failed to recognize the extraordinary value of your mother." Ethan absorbed this, his expression revealing nothing. "Did you ever think about me? Over the years?" "No," Richard admitted, the truth painful but necessary. "I deliberately chose not to think about the pregnancy. I told myself it wasn't my concern anymore." He paused, looking down at his hands. "It was easier that way." The conversation continued, uncomfortable but necessary. Ethan asked direct questions about Richard's family, his upbringing, and his business. Richard answered honestly, gradually realizing that the boy wasn't seeking a father but rather filling in blank spaces in his own identity. "Do you regret it?" Ethan asked toward the end of their hour together. "Not the abandonment. I can see you regret that now that my mother is successful. I mean, do you regret not knowing me all these years?" The question pierced Richard's carefully constructed narrative. "Yes," he whispered, surprising himself with the depth of emotion behind the word. "More than you can imagine." As Ethan prepared to leave, he hesitated. "I don't know if I want to see you again. I need to think." Richard nodded, fighting disappointment. "I understand. Thank you for meeting me today." Sarah, who had been watching discreetly from a distance, rejoined them. "Ready?" she asked Ethan, who nodded. "Thank you, Sarah," Richard said quietly, "for allowing this." She regarded him with cool assessment. "This was Ethan's choice. My only concern is his well-being." 3 months passed in which Richard's professional life continued its downward spiral. The Thompson Hotel's board called an emergency meeting in early July, the agenda containing only one item: leadership transition. "The brand has suffered irreparable damage," the board chairman stated, not bothering with pleasantries. "The public narrative of you abandoning a pregnant woman who went on to become one of America's most admired entrepreneurs is not something we can overcome while you remain the face of this company." Richard sat silently as they outlined the terms of his removal, a generous severance package in exchange for a quiet departure. His family's company, built over generations, would continue without a Thompson at the helm for the first time in its century-long history. He signed the papers without argument, understanding that fighting would only extend the inevitable. As he cleared his office later that day, removing family photographs and mementos, Richard reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since seeing Sarah at the awards ceremony. His engagement to Cassandra had ended acrimoniously, his professional identity had been stripped away, and his public reputation lay in tatters. During these difficult months, Ethan had agreed to 2 more meetings, brief, carefully controlled encounters that left Richard uncertain where they stood. The boy was unfailingly polite but maintained emotional distance, clearly processing the complexity of their connection in his own way. One evening in late August, Richard received an unexpected delivery, an envelope containing a single ticket to the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. Inside was a program for the premiere of Symphony No. 3 by Ethan Walker, performed by the National Symphony Orchestra. No note accompanied it, but the message was clear, an invitation, perhaps a tentative olive branch. The night of the performance, Richard sat alone in the last row of the balcony, having deliberately arrived late to avoid media attention. The Kennedy Center buzzed with anticipation. Ethan's precocious talent had attracted significant interest in the classical music world. When the lights dimmed and the orchestra took their positions, Richard leaned forward. Ethan walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause, looking both younger and older than his 15 years in formal attire. Instead of taking a seat at the piano, as Richard had expected, Ethan stepped onto the conductor's podium and raised his baton. The music began softly, almost tentatively, before building into something complex and powerful. Richard, who appreciated classical music without truly understanding it, found himself moved beyond expectation. There was something in the composition that spoke of journey, of hardship transformed into strength, of beauty emerging from darkness. In the front row, Sarah watched her son with evident pride, occasionally brushing away tears. Richard observed them from his distant seat, finally comprehending the magnitude of what he had discarded 15 years ago. Not just a wife and child, but the chance to be part of something meaningful, something that would outlast the material success he had prioritized. After the performance concluded to a standing ovation, reporters surrounded Sarah and Ethan in the lobby. Richard remained in the shadows, watching from a distance. "How does it feel being the youngest composer to premiere at the Kennedy Center?" a journalist asked. "I'm grateful for the opportunity," Ethan replied diplomatically, "and eternally grateful to my mother, who believed in me when I was just a possibility." Another reporter thrust a microphone toward Sarah. "Ms. Walker, industry analysts suggest Nightingale will be the first music platform to reach 100 million paying users by year's end. Any comment?" Sarah smiled, her hand resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder. "The future of music doesn't belong to intermediaries, but to creators and their audience. Nightingale simply built the bridge between them." From his place in the shadows, Richard watched as Sarah and Ethan entered their waiting limousine surrounded by admirers. He finally understood the magnitude of his loss. Not just the family he had rejected, but the opportunity to be part of something genuinely significant. Sarah Walker hadn't needed revenge. Her most powerful response had been living extraordinarily well without him, building a legacy that time would not erase. As the limousine pulled away, she didn't look back, not out of lingering resentment, but because her gaze remained firmly fixed on the future she continued to create. The voice Richard had once called mediocre now echoed in the greatest halls of power. And he remained in the audience, a silent witness to the success he could have shared, if only he had recognized the value of what he had so carelessly discarded. If you enjoyed today's video, I'm sure you'll love the next one. Don't waste time. Just click on the screen.